The autumn wind of 1987 carried the scent of decay through the Vermont mountains as Dr. Marcus Whitmore stepped out of his weathered pickup truck. At 43, the archaeologist had spent most of his career buried in the dust of ancient civilizations. But this assignment felt different, more personal, more immediate. The ruins before him weren't thousands of years old. They were merely decades removed from living memory. The McDonald family chapel stood like a broken tooth against the grey October sky. What remained of its stone walls rose no higher than 8 feet, covered in a tapestry of moss and ivy that seemed to pulse with each gust of wind. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only skeletal wooden beams that pointed accusingly toward the heavens. Marcus pulled his leather jacket tighter as he approached the structure. The local historical society had commissioned him to document the site before winter set in, but their briefing had been frustratingly sparse. A family had vanished in 1901. A chapel had been built. Questions remained unanswered. The iron gate that once protected the sacred ground hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking a mournful song that echoed off the surrounding pine trees. Marcus pushed it open, wincing at the metallic shriek that seemed to disturb something deeper than silence. Inside the chapel's remains, fallen leaves had accumulated in drifts against the walls. The stone floor, though cracked and uneven, still bore the outline of wooden pews that had rotted away decades ago. At the far end, a simple stone altar remained intact, its surface stained dark with what Marcus hoped was merely the passage of time. He set down his equipment bag and pulled out his camera, beginning the methodical process of documentation. Through the viewfinder, the chapel looked even more foreboding. Shadows seemed to pool in corners where no shadows should exist, and the remaining walls appeared to lean inward, as if the structure was slowly collapsing in on itself. As he worked, Marcus became aware of an odd quality to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an abandoned place, but something more oppressive, a silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water. Even the wind, which had been constant since his arrival, seemed muted within the chapel walls. Near the altar, something caught his eye. Kneeling on the cold stone, Marcus brushed away decades of debris to reveal deep gouges in the floor. The marks were deliberate, carved with desperate intensity. They formed no recognizable pattern, but their very randomness spoke of panic, of fingernails scraping against stone in final, futile gestures. "What happened here?" Marcus whispered to himself, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. As if in response, a piece of mortar crumbled from the wall behind him, the small sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Marcus turned, his heart rate quickening, but saw nothing except the empty doorway framing the darkening Vermont landscape. He forced himself to continue working, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. The shadows seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, and twice he could have sworn he heard the faint echo of voices, not from outside, but from somewhere beneath his feet. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long fingers of orange light through the chapel's broken walls, Marcus made a discovery that would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. Hidden beneath a loose stone near the altar, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived nearly 9 decades, was a leather-bound journal. The cover bore the name Ezra McDonald in faded gold lettering. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened to the first page, where neat handwriting proclaimed, "The Lord has blessed us with this land, and we shall build his house upon it. May our prayers rise like incense to heaven, and may his peace dwell within these walls forever." The date read March 15th, 1901. As darkness settled over the ruins, Marcus carefully closed the journal and gathered his equipment. The weight of the discovery pressed upon him like the chapel's oppressive silence. He had come seeking historical documentation, but he had found something far more unsettling, a voice from the past, speaking from the very heart of the mystery. Walking back to his truck, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Not footsteps, the silence was too complete for that, but a presence that moved with him through the gathering darkness. He didn't look back until he reached his vehicle, and when he finally did, the chapel stood empty and still. But for just a moment, in the dying light, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall, gaunt, and perfectly motionless, as if it had been waiting there for 86 years. Marcus drove away quickly, the journal burning like a coal in his jacket pocket, carrying with it the weight of unanswered prayers and the promise of revelations that might be better left buried. The Riverside Inn sat like a weathered sentinel on the banks of the White River, its Victorian architecture a testament to Vermont's more prosperous past. Marcus had chosen it not for comfort, but for its proximity to the McDonald property and its reputation as a repository of local memory. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had lived in the area her entire 78 years. Marcus spread Ezra McDonald's journal across the small table in his room, the pages yellowed but remarkably preserved. The early entries painted a picture of a devout family man, proud of his growing prosperity and determined to honor God with a chapel on his land. Ezra wrote of his wife, Margaret, and their 3 children, Thomas, age 16, Sarah, 14, and little Mary, only 8 years old. "The foundation stones are laid," read an entry from April 2nd, 1901. "Thomas worked beside me today, his young hands already showing the calluses of honest labor. Margaret brought us water and spoke of the beautiful services we shall hold come winter. The children are excited to have their own place of worship, away from the long journey to town." But as Marcus read deeper into the journal, the tone began to shift. By late April, Ezra's handwriting had become more erratic, his words tinged with an unease he couldn't quite articulate. April 28th, 1901. "Something troubles me about the chapel, though I cannot say what. The acoustics are strange. Our voices seem to echo from places where no echo should exist. Margaret noticed it too during yesterday's evening prayers. She said it felt as though someone else was speaking our words back to us, but from beneath the floor." Marcus paused, remembering the voices he thought he'd heard the previous day. He glanced toward the window, where the last light of day was fading behind the mountains, then returned to the journal. May 15th, 1901. "The children no longer wish to pray in the chapel. Little Mary claims she hears whispers when we kneel at the altar, whispers that speak in tongues she does not recognize. Thomas, usually so brave, refuses to enter after sunset. I have told them it is merely the wind through the stones, but in truth I hear it too. It is not wind." A knock at the door interrupted Marcus's reading. Mrs. Hartwell stood in the hallway, carrying a tray with tea and what appeared to be homemade cookies. "Thought you might need some sustenance," she said, her keen eyes immediately focusing on the journal. "My goodness, is that Ezra McDonald's journal?" Marcus confirmed, accepting the tray gratefully. "I found it hidden in the chapel ruins." Mrs. Hartwell's face paled visibly. She set the tray down with trembling hands and sank into the room's only chair. "I never thought, after all these years, I never thought anything would be found." "You knew the family?" "Not personally, mind you. I was only 8 when they disappeared. But my grandmother, God rest her soul, she knew Margaret McDonald well. They were friends, attended the same quilting circle in town." Mrs. Hartwell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Grandmother always said there was something unnatural about that disappearance." Marcus leaned forward, his academic instincts overriding his growing unease. "What did she tell you?" "The McDonalds were regular churchgoers, never missed a Sunday service in town, but after they built that chapel, they stopped coming altogether." Reverend Blackwood was concerned. He rode out to check on them in early June of 1901. Mrs. Hartwell paused, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He found the chapel door locked from the inside, but no one answered his calls. When the sheriff finally broke down the door 3 days later, the place was empty. Not just empty, It was as if the family had simply vanished mid-prayer. Mid-prayer, the altar was set for service. Candles were still burning, though they should have guttered out hours before. The family Bible was open to Psalms, and there were 5 sets of knee impressions in the dust before the altar, as if they'd been kneeling there for a very long time. Mrs. Hartwell's voice cracked slightly, but strangest of all, there were scratches in the stone floor around the altar. Deep scratches, like fingernails clawing at rock. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, remembering the gouges he'd discovered near the altar. What happened to the investigation? Sheriff declared it an unsolved disappearance. Some folks thought they'd run off to escape debts, but Ezra McDonald was a prosperous man. Others whispered about foul play, but there was no evidence of violence. The chapel was sealed up, and eventually people just stopped talking about it. After Mrs. Hartwell left, Marcus returned to the journal with renewed urgency. The entries from late May and early June painted an increasingly disturbing picture. May 30th, 1901. Margaret refuses to enter the chapel now. She claims the whispers have grown louder, more insistent. Last night she swore she heard them calling our names, one by one, in voices that sounded like our own. I told her she was imagining things, but when I went to check the chapel this morning, I found fresh scratches around the altar. No animal could have made such marks. June 3rd, 1901. I fear we have built something unholy. The chapel draws us to it, even as it terrifies us. Thomas found me standing at the altar this morning with no memory of how I got there. The children speak of dreams where they are kneeling in the chapel, praying words they do not understand to something that is not God. Margaret begs me to tear it down, but I cannot. Something will not let me. The final entry was dated June 7th, 1901, and the handwriting was barely legible, as if written in great haste or extreme distress. It calls to us now in daylight. The whispers have become voices, and the voices have become commands. We cannot resist much longer. Margaret says we must flee, but our feet carry us only toward the chapel. The children's eyes are empty now, reflecting something that lives beneath the stones. If anyone finds this, do not enter the chapel after dark. Do not kneel at the altar. Do not listen to the voices that speak your prayers back to you in your own voice. Some silences are not empty. Some silences are full of things that should not be fed. Marcus closed the journal with shaking hands. Outside his window, full darkness had fallen, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the wind, he could swear he heard the sound of voices raised in prayer. 5 voices harmonizing in perfect, impossible unison. He did not sleep that night. Dawn came gray and reluctant to the Vermont mountains, filtered through a thick layer of clouds that seemed to press down upon the landscape like a burial shroud. Marcus had spent the sleepless night poring over the journal, making notes, and trying to rationalize what he'd read. In the harsh light of morning, academic skepticism warred with the growing dread that had taken root in his chest. He returned to the chapel site armed with more sophisticated equipment, ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis tools, and a digital recorder to document any acoustic anomalies. If there were answers to be found, they would be found through scientific method, not superstition. The chapel ruins looked different in daylight, less menacing but somehow more melancholy. The morning mist clung to the broken walls like ghostly fingers, and the silence that had so unnerved him the day before seemed less oppressive, though no less complete. Marcus began with the ground-penetrating radar, methodically scanning the chapel floor in a grid pattern. The device painted a picture of the subsurface in green and amber lines on its small screen, revealing the foundations, scattered debris, and, unexpectedly, what appeared to be a void beneath the altar. "Interesting," Marcus murmured, adjusting the radar settings for a deeper scan. The void was roughly rectangular, about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned directly beneath where the altar stone rested. It could be a natural cave formation, but its regular shape suggested human construction. As he worked, Marcus became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The mist was lifting, but instead of revealing the familiar Vermont landscape, it seemed to be drawing inward, concentrating within the chapel walls. The temperature, already cool for October, dropped noticeably. He set up his digital recorder near the altar and began documenting his findings. October 15th, 1987, 9:47 a.m. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed what appears to be a chamber or void beneath the altar stone. Dimensions suggest deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Proceeding with acoustic analysis. The acoustic tests yielded results that made Marcus question his equipment. Sound waves directed downward from various points in the chapel returned with impossible echoes, not just from the void beneath the altar, but from multiple points that seemed to extend far deeper than the radar could penetrate. It was as if the chapel sat atop a vast network of chambers, all connected by passages too narrow for the radar to detect. More disturbing still, when Marcus played back his recorded voice, he could hear additional sounds beneath his words, faint whispers that seemed to mirror his speech, creating an eerie harmony that raised the hair on his arms. "This is impossible," he said aloud, then immediately regretted it as his words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, echoing from directions that defied the chapel's simple geometry. Determined to solve the mystery through physical investigation, Marcus began the delicate process of moving the altar stone. It was heavier than it appeared, requiring a combination of leverage and careful maneuvering to shift it even slightly. As he worked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, he noticed that the scratches in the floor extended beneath the stone, not random gouges, but deliberate markings that formed a pattern. When he finally managed to shift the altar enough to reveal what lay beneath, Marcus's breath caught in his throat. A narrow stone staircase descended into darkness, its steps worn smooth by countless feet. The air that rose from the opening carried a scent that was both ancient and organic, not the mustiness of age, but something that suggested life, or what remained of it. Marcus retrieved a powerful flashlight from his equipment bag and directed its beam into the opening. The staircase descended about 12 feet, before opening into what appeared to be a larger chamber. The walls were carved from living rock, and strange symbols covered every visible surface. Not the Christian iconography one might expect beneath a chapel, but something far older and more primitive. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, Marcus began his descent. The chamber below was larger than the chapel above, its ceiling supported by natural stone pillars that had been carved with the same mysterious symbols. But it was what occupied the center of the space that made Marcus's blood run cold. 5 stone slabs were arranged in a circle around a central depression in the floor. Each slab bore the carved outline of a human form, 2 adults and 3 children, their proportions matching what Marcus knew of the McDonald family. The stone was stained dark, and the air above each slab shimmered slightly, as if with heat waves, though the chamber was bitterly cold. In the central depression lay a collection of objects that told a story more horrifying than any journal entry. 5 sets of clothing, perfectly preserved despite the passage of decades. A man's work shirt and trousers, a woman's dress and apron. Children's garments ranging from a teenager's coat to a small girl's pinafore. All were arranged as if their wearers had simply dissolved, leaving only empty fabric behind. But most disturbing of all were the sounds. As Marcus stood in the chamber, his flashlight beam dancing across the carved walls, he began to hear them. The whispers Ezra McDonald had written about. They seemed to come from the stone itself, a constant murmur of voices speaking in unison, their words just beyond comprehension. The whispers grew louder as Marcus approached the central depression, and with growing horror he realized they were prayers, fragments of familiar psalms and hymns, but spoken in reverse, the sacred words twisted into something that felt fundamentally wrong. His digital recorder, still running, captured every sound, but when Marcus looked at its display, the audio levels showed impossible readings, sounds registering from frequencies that human ears couldn't detect, voices layered upon voices in harmonies that seemed to extend infinitely downward. As he backed away from the central depression, Marcus's foot struck something metallic. Looking down, he saw a small brass plate embedded in the floor, its surface covered with symbols that matched those on the walls. But unlike the carved symbols, these seemed to move in his peripheral vision, shifting and rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers suddenly stopped. In the absolute silence that followed, Marcus heard something that made his heart race. Footsteps on the stone stairs above, slow and deliberate, as if someone was descending to join him in the chamber. But he was alone. He had been alone all morning. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and Marcus turned his flashlight toward the entrance. Nothing. But the silence now felt different. Not empty, but expectant, as if the chamber itself was holding its breath. Then from directly behind him came a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The soft whisper of his own voice, speaking words he had never said, in a tone of reverence and terror that was unmistakably his own. "The prayers have been answered," his voice said, though his lips never moved. "The silence is complete." Marcus ran. He stumbled up the stone stairs, his flashlight beam wild and erratic, the whispers resuming behind him in a crescendo of impossible voices. He emerged from beneath the altar, gasping and shaking, the October air feeling warm against his skin after the bone-deep cold of the chamber below. But as he stood in the ruins of the chapel, trying to catch his breath and process what he had seen, Marcus realized with growing dread that the whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, just at the edge of hearing, following him up from the depths like smoke rising from a fire that could never be extinguished. And somewhere in that chorus of voices, he could swear he heard 5 distinct tones: a man, a woman, and 3 children, all speaking his name in perfect, terrifying unison. Marcus drove back to the Riverside Inn in a state barely controlled panic, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The digital recorder sat on the passenger seat like an accusation, its red recording light still blinking, capturing sounds that shouldn't exist. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for him in the inn's small lobby, her weathered face creased with concern. "Dr. Whitmore, you look as though you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Marcus managed, his voice hoarse. He needed answers, and Mrs. Hartwell was his only connection to the area's living memory. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to know everything your grandmother told you about the McDonalds. Everything, no matter how strange it might sound." The elderly woman studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come to the kitchen. I'll make tea and we'll talk properly." The inn's kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting scents of baking bread and cinnamon. Mrs. Hartwell moved with practiced efficiency, preparing tea while Marcus sat at the worn wooden table, trying to organize his thoughts into something resembling coherence. "My grandmother was a practical woman," Mrs. Hartwell began, settling into the chair across from him, "not given to flights of fancy or superstition, but the McDonald disappearance, it changed her. She never spoke of it lightly. What did she know about the land before the McDonalds bought it?" Mrs. Hartwell's hands stilled on her teacup. "That's just it. The land wasn't empty when they bought it. There had been something there before. Something the local Abenaki tribes considered sacred, or perhaps cursed. Grandmother said the tribal elders warned against building on that particular spot, but Ezra MacDonald was a God-fearing man who put no stock in what he called heathen superstitions." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "What kind of sacred site?" "A place of communication, according to grandmother's stories. The Abenaki believed it was where the boundary between worlds was thinnest, where voices from the other side could be heard." They used it for rituals, but carefully, with proper protections and ceremonies. They never built permanent structures there. They knew better. The pieces were beginning to form a horrifying picture in Marcus's mind. And the McDonalds built their chapel directly on top of this site. Not just on top of it, into it. Grandmother said Ezra found the stone chambers when he was digging the foundation. Instead of filling them in or building elsewhere, he incorporated them into his design. He thought he was being practical, using the natural stone formations to create a deeper foundation for his chapel. Marcus pulled out his notebook and began sketching what he remembered of the underground chamber. "Mrs. Hartwell, did your grandmother ever mention anything about the symbols carved in the stone or about voices that seemed to come from beneath the ground?" Mrs. Hartwell's face went pale. "How could you know about the symbols? No one's been in those chambers since..." Since when?" "Since the night my grandmother and 2 other women went to the chapel to look for the McDonald family." Mrs. Hartwell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "This was 3 days after they disappeared, before the sheriff broke down the door. Grandmother was worried about Margaret. They were close friends, and it wasn't like her to miss their weekly quilting circle without word." Marcus leaned forward, his academic training warring with a growing sense of dread. "What did they find?" The chapel door was locked from the inside, just as the sheriff later discovered. But grandmother heard voices coming from within, the entire McDonald family praying together. She called out to them, but they didn't respond. The prayers continued, word for word the same, over and over again, as if they were stuck in some kind of loop. How long did this go on? Hours. Grandmother and the other women waited outside until dawn, listening to those endless prayers. But as the sun rose, the voices began to change. They became hollow, grandmother said, like echoes of echoes, growing fainter but never stopping. And underneath them, she began to hear something else, whispers in a language she didn't recognize, speaking in harmony with the prayers, but saying different words entirely. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. Did she ever go back? Once. After the sheriff's investigation turned up nothing, grandmother returned alone. She found the loose stone near the altar, the same one where you found the journal, I'd wager, and discovered the entrance to the chambers below. She went down there? Mrs. Hartwell nodded grimly. She was a brave woman, and she loved Margaret MacDonald like a sister. She thought perhaps the family was hiding down there, afraid to come out for some reason. But what she found... Mrs. Hartwell paused, her hands trembling slightly. She found the stone slabs, the carved symbols, and the clothing. But she also found something else, something she never told anyone except me, and only on her deathbed. Marcus waited, his heart pounding. She found them, Mrs. Hartwell whispered. The MacDonald family. They were there in the chamber, kneeling around the central depression just as they had been in life. But they weren't solid anymore. Grandmother said they looked like shadows made of mist, translucent but still recognizable. And they were still praying, their lips moving in perfect synchronization, their voices creating the whispers she'd heard from above. What did she do? She tried to speak to them, to call them back somehow, but when she spoke Margaret's name, all 5 figures turned to look at her. Their eyes... Mrs. Hartwell shuddered. Grandmother said their eyes were empty, but not vacant. They were full of something else, something that wasn't them anymore. And when they opened their mouths to respond, it wasn't their voices that came out. It was the voice of whatever had been listening to their prayers from the beginning. Marcus felt the room spinning slightly. What did it say? It thanked her for coming. It said the prayers were almost complete, that the family had been such faithful servants, and that soon there would be room for more voices in the choir. It invited her to kneel with them, to add her voice to theirs, to help them finish what they had started. But she escaped, barely. She ran up those stairs faster than she'd ever moved in her life, and she never went back. But the voices followed her home that night. She could hear them whispering her name, calling to her from beneath the floorboards, from inside the walls, from anywhere that shadows gathered. It took weeks before they finally faded, and even then, she never felt entirely free of them. Marcus thought of his own experience in the chamber, of hearing his voice speak words he'd never said. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you heard anything unusual since I arrived? Any voices, any whispers?" Mrs. Hartwell's face crumpled. "Last night, after I brought you tea, I heard Margaret MacDonald calling my name from the basement, clear as day, in the same voice I remembered from when I was a child. She was asking me to come down, to help her with something important. I almost went." Tears began to flow down her weathered cheeks. "God help me, I almost went." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "We need to contact the authorities. This site needs to be sealed, studied properly, maybe even destroyed." "You don't understand," Mrs. Hartwell said, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's too late for that. By opening the chamber, by hearing the voices, you've become part of it now. They know you're here, and they won't let you leave until you've given them what they want." As if summoned by her words, Marcus's digital recorder, which he'd left on the table, suddenly crackled to life. Through its small speaker came the sound of 5 voices raised in perfect harmony, singing a hymn he recognized from his childhood. But the words were wrong, twisted into something that made his skin crawl and his vision blur at the edges. And underneath the hymn, barely audible but unmistakably present, was the sound of his own voice, learning the words, preparing to join the eternal choir that waited beneath the stones of the MacDonald family chapel. The recording played for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt anything but empty. The decision came to Marcus in the grey hours before dawn, as he sat in his room listening to the whispers that now followed him everywhere. He could not run from this. The voices had made that clear. Every time he tried to pack his equipment, his hands would freeze, and he would hear his own voice calling to him from the chapel, patient and insistent, reminding him that his work was not yet finished. Mrs. Hartwell had not slept either. When Marcus came downstairs at first light, he found her in the kitchen, fully dressed and clutching a worn leather Bible. "You're going back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to. Whatever's down there, it won't stop until it gets what it wants. And I think I know what that is now." Marcus had spent the night studying the symbols he'd sketched from the chamber walls, cross-referencing them with his knowledge of pre-Columbian religious practices. The pattern that emerged was both ancient and terrifyingly logical. The site wasn't just a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. It was a place where that boundary could be deliberately weakened, where voices from beyond could be given form and substance through the power of prayer and sacrifice. The Abenaki knew how to use it safely, Marcus explained, as Mrs. Hartwell poured coffee with shaking hands. They had rituals, protections, ways to communicate without being consumed. But the MacDonalds, they built their chapel as an amplifier, focusing all their prayers into that chamber below. They fed it with their devotion until it became strong enough to take them. And now, it wants you. Marcus nodded grimly, but I think there might be a way to stop it. The symbols in the chamber, they're not just decorative, they're instructions, a kind of spiritual technology. If I can understand them properly, I might be able to reverse what the MacDonalds started. Mrs. Hartwell gripped his arm. Or you might make it stronger. Dr. Whitmore, that thing has been waiting for 86 years for someone with the knowledge to complete its work. What if that someone is you? The possibility had occurred to Marcus, but he pushed it aside. Then I'll have to make sure I don't give it what it wants. He gathered his equipment one final time, adding items that had nothing to do with archaeology: salt, iron nails, and a small vial of holy water he'd requested from the local priest. If he was going to face something that existed in the spaces between faith and fear, he would need more than scientific instruments. The chapel ruins looked different in the morning light, somehow more solid and present than they had before. The mist that had been gathering around the site for days now formed a perfect circle around the broken walls, as if the very air was being drawn into the structure. Marcus approached the altar with steady steps, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The stone had shifted back into place during the night, but it moved easily now, as if eager to reveal the entrance to the chamber below. The whispers began as soon as he started his descent, but they were different now, more urgent, more welcoming. 5 distinct voices called his name in harmony, their tones filled with what sounded like genuine joy at his return. The chamber was exactly as he had left it, but the air above the stone slabs now shimmered more visibly, and the shadows cast by his flashlight seemed to move independently of their sources. The McDonald family was there, just as Mrs. Hartwell's grandmother had described, translucent figures kneeling around the central depression, their lips moving in constant prayer. As Marcus entered the chamber, all 5 figures turned to look at him. Their faces were recognizable from an old daguerreotype he'd found in the town's historical archives, but their eyes held depths that belonged to something far older than human memory. "Dr. Whitmore," said the figure of Ezra MacDonald, though the voice that emerged was a harmony of tones that seemed to come from the stone itself. "We have been waiting for you. Our prayers are almost complete, but we need one more voice to finish the work." Marcus forced himself to speak calmly, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "What work? What are you trying to accomplish?" "We are opening the way," replied the figure of Margaret MacDonald, her voice layered with harmonics that made Marcus's teeth ache. "The boundary between worlds has grown thin here, and with enough voices, enough faith, we can tear it open completely. Think of it, direct communication with the divine, unfiltered by doubt or distance." That's not the divine you're communicating with," Marcus said, pulling out his notebook and beginning to sketch the symbols on the walls. "You've been deceived. Whatever answered your prayers, it's not God." The figure of young Mary MacDonald tilted her head, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "How can you be so certain? We have felt its presence, heard its voice, experienced its power. It has given us eternal life, eternal purpose." "What more proof do you need?" Marcus continued sketching, his academic mind working to decode the symbolic language carved into the stone. The pattern was becoming clearer, a ritual of summoning and binding designed to create a permanent gateway between dimensions. The McDonalds hadn't been consumed by whatever they'd contacted. They'd been transformed into living anchors, holding the gateway partially open through the power of their endless prayers. "Because," Marcus said, completing his analysis of the symbols, "what you're describing isn't divine communication, it's invasion. You're not opening a door to heaven, you're tearing a hole in reality itself." The 5 figures rose in unison, their translucent forms becoming more solid as they moved. "You understand so little," said the voice of Thomas MacDonald, "but you will learn. Add your voice to ours, and you will see the truth of what we have accomplished." Marcus pulled out the iron nails and began driving them into specific points around the chamber, following the pattern he'd decoded from the symbols. Each nail struck stone with a sound like a bell tolling, and with each impact, the whispers in the air grew more agitated. "What are you doing?" demanded the collective voice of the MacDonald family, their forms flickering like candle flames in a wind. "I'm finishing what you started," Marcus replied, pulling out the vial of holy water. "But not the way you intended." The symbols on the walls had told him everything he needed to know. The ritual the MacDonalds had unknowingly begun required 5 voices to open the gateway, but it required 6 to close it permanently. The 6th voice had to come from someone who understood the true nature of what they were facing, someone who could speak the words of binding rather than summoning. Marcus began to recite the counter-ritual he'd pieced together from the symbols, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber as he spoke words in the ancient Abenaki tongue. The holy water hissed as it struck the stone slabs, and the iron nails began to glow with a cold blue light. The McDonald family's forms writhed and twisted, their harmonious voices becoming discordant screams. "You don't understand what you're doing!" they cried in unison. "Without us, the gateway will collapse. The voices from beyond will be trapped on this side." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Marcus replied, continuing his recitation. The symbols on the walls were beginning to change, the carved lines shifting and rearranging themselves as the binding ritual took hold. But as Marcus spoke the final words of the counter-ritual, he realized with growing horror that the McDonald family had been telling the truth about one thing. He didn't fully understand what he was doing. The gateway wasn't just closing, it was inverting, turning inside out like a cosmic wound healing in reverse. The whispers that had plagued him for days suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The translucent figures of the McDonald family froze mid-scream, their forms becoming solid for one brief moment before crumbling to dust that was immediately absorbed by the stone slabs. Marcus felt a tremendous pressure in his ears, as if he were diving to great depths, and then something fundamental shifted in the chamber around him. The air itself seemed to thicken, and the shadows cast by his flashlight began moving with purpose and intelligence. He had succeeded in closing the gateway, but in doing so, he had trapped whatever had been trying to come through on this side of reality. And now it was free to act directly in the physical world, no longer constrained by the need to work through human intermediaries. The chamber began to shake, dust and small stones raining from the ceiling as something vast and invisible pressed against the boundaries of the space. Marcus's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into absolute darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. It was full of presence, of intelligence, of something that had been waiting for 86 years to be fully unleashed. In the blackness, Marcus heard his own voice speaking words he had never learned, in languages that predated human civilization. The entity that had been feeding on the McDonald family's prayers was now speaking through him, using his knowledge and his understanding to complete its manifestation in the physical world. Marcus tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He tried to scream, but only those alien words emerged from his throat. As his consciousness faded, overwhelmed by the presence that was taking control of his body, he understood with perfect clarity what he had done. He hadn't saved anyone. He had simply changed the nature of the threat. The last thing Marcus remembered was the sound of footsteps on the stone stairs above, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably his own, as something wearing his body climbed up from the depths to begin its work in the world above. Epilogue: The Spreading Silence. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell found Dr. Marcus Whitmore's truck still parked outside the chapel ruins 3 days later when he failed to return to the inn. The local sheriff organized a search, but they found no trace of the archaeologist anywhere on the McDonald property. The chapel ruins themselves had changed. The broken walls now stood perfectly straight, as if rebuilt by invisible hands, and the iron gate hung properly on its hinges. Most disturbing of all, the oppressive silence that had characterized the site for decades was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. Mrs. Hartwell never spoke publicly about what she found in Dr. Whitmore's abandoned room. His notes scattered across the floor, his equipment bag empty, and his final journal entry, written in handwriting that grew progressively less recognizable with each line. The ritual is complete, the gateway is closed, but the guardian is free. It wears my knowledge now, my understanding of this world and its people. It will be patient, as it has always been patient. It will build new chapels, gather new voices, and this time it will not make the mistake of revealing itself too soon. The McDonald family served their purpose, but they were limited by their humanity. their need for food and sleep, and the comfort of familiar prayers. I am different. I'm educated, connected, trusted by institutions and colleagues around the world. The work begins again, but this time it will not be confined to a single family in a remote Vermont chapel. This time, it will spread like a whisper through the academic community, through universities and museums, through every place where knowledge is gathered and shared. The silence is no longer contained. It is learning to speak with my voice, to think with my mind, to move through the world with my credentials and my reputation. And when it has gathered enough voices, when it has built enough chapels in enough places, it will finally complete what the McDonalds began. The boundary between worlds will not just be opened, it will be erased entirely, and in that moment, the silence will no longer need to whisper, it will be able to sing. Mrs. Hartwell burned the journal that same night, but she could not burn the memory of its words. She lived for 3 more years, during which time she received regular letters from Dr. Marcus Whitmore, updating her on his research and thanking her for her hospitality. The letters were perfectly normal, written in his familiar handwriting and bearing his authentic signature, but Mrs. Hartwell never answered them because she had attended Dr. Marcus Whitmore's memorial service 6 months after his disappearance, and she had watched them lower an empty coffin into the ground of the Riverside Cemetery. The letters continued to arrive long after her death, addressed to subsequent owners of the Riverside Inn. They always contained the same message, written in the same careful handwriting: the work continues. New chapels are being built, new voices are being gathered. The silence grows stronger with each prayer, and soon it will be strong enough to sing the world into a new shape entirely. Thank you for your part in making this possible. Your grandmother would be proud to know that her story helped us understand what we needed to do. The MacDonald family sends their regards from the place where all prayers eventually go to die. With eternal gratitude, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, Professor of Archaeology, Miskatonic University. And in chapels and churches across New England, in university lecture halls and museum basements, in any place where knowledge was gathered and shared, people began to report the same phenomenon. Voices in the walls, whispers beneath the floorboards, and the growing certainty that their prayers were being heard by something that was definitely listening, but was definitely not God. The silence that had once been contained within the ruins of a single Vermont chapel was learning to speak with 1,000 voices, and it was very, very patient. After all, it had been waiting for centuries to be properly introduced to the world. Now, finally, it was ready to make some